When you picture an outlaw from the American frontier, your mind probably conjures images of grizzled men with six-shooters on their hips, dusty from the trail, wanted posters bearing their names plastered across every sheriff's office from Texas to Montana. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Butch Cassidy. The legends we've been told are soaked in testosterone, tales of brotherhood and honor among thieves, of men living free and dying young in a land where only the strong survived. Hollywood gave us John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, granite-jawed men facing down danger without flinching. History books wrote endless chapters about male outlaws, male sheriffs, male gunfighters. The entire mythology of the West became a story about masculinity, about what it meant to be a man in an untamed land. But there's a problem with this picture. It's incomplete. It's a lie by omission. Because while history books and Hollywood focused their attention on the men who robbed trains and held up banks, they conveniently overlooked something equally dangerous, equally ruthless, and just as cunning as any male desperado who ever lived. They overlooked the women. These weren't the saloon girls serving drinks with practiced smiles. They weren't the dutiful wives waiting at home for their husbands to return from whatever violence the day had required. They weren't the school teachers, or the dance hall performers, or the soiled doves working in the brothels. No, these women were something else entirely. These were women who cut their hair short and bound their breasts to pass as teenage boys, then held loaded shotguns on grown men who never suspected the truth. Women who organized hideouts for the most wanted criminals in America, turning their ranches into criminal headquarters, where fugitives could rest between robberies. Women who participated in train heists that netted tens of thousands of dollars, who forged documents with such skill that even bank officials couldn't detect the fraud, who rode with the most notorious gangs in the West and earned their respect through sheer competence and icy nerves. They served time in prisons and emerged unbroken. They tortured people for information about hidden gold. They walked into courtrooms and delivered speeches about women's rights while standing trial for armed robbery, manipulating all male juries with a combination of beauty, intelligence, and audacity that left judges furious and lawmen baffled. They escaped from jails by digging through adobe walls with their bare hands. They gathered intelligence from unsuspecting men in gambling halls, using charm and deception to plan stagecoach robberies. They harbored killers, fenced stolen goods, and built criminal empires that operated for years before the law could touch them. These were criminals, escape artists, and master manipulators who understood something fundamental about the society they lived in. They understood that every assumption people made about the gentler sex, about women being naturally peaceful, naturally maternal, naturally incapable of violence, was a weapon they could use. While lawmen searched for male bandits, women moved freely. While witnesses described the men who robbed them, they never considered that one of those men might have been a woman in disguise. These women proved themselves every bit as ruthless, and often more so than their male counterparts. They had to be, because a woman caught committing crimes faced not just legal punishment, but complete social destruction. There was no going back to respectable society once you crossed that line. So when these women chose the outlaw life, they committed to it fully. Half measures would get you killed. Hesitation would get you caught. These women learned to be colder, smarter, and more vicious than the men around them, because anything less meant prison or death. This is the story of the women who really ran the West, the outlaws whose crimes shocked a nation, and whose audacity terrified lawmen from coast to coast. Their names were Belle Starr, Pearl Hart, Laura Bullion, and Belle Siddons. Some of them became famous in their own time, their faces on wanted posters, and their exploits recounted in sensational newspaper stories. Others worked in the shadows, their contributions to major crimes only discovered decades later. Some died violently, shot in the back by unknown assassins, or vanished into obscurity, their fates unknown. Others lived long enough to become respectable citizens, keeping their violent pasts secret until their deaths. But all of them, every single one, proved something that Victorian society desperately wanted to deny. Women were capable of the same violence, the same ruthlessness, the same criminal genius as any man. By the time you understand the scope of their crimes and the audacity of their methods, you'll understand why the men of the Old West feared them most of all. Because a male outlaw was a known quantity, a visible threat. But a female outlaw, she could be anyone. She could be the quiet woman buying supplies at the general store. She could be the well-dressed lady riding side saddle past the sheriff's office. She could be the young boy holding up your stagecoach. You'd never know until it was too late. And that made them the most dangerous outlaws of all. The American West in the years following the Civil War was a land of possibility and peril. Between 1865 and 1900, the frontier represented everything the established East was not. It was wild, lawless, and utterly unforgiving. For men, this meant opportunity to reinvent themselves, to escape their past, to strike it rich, or die trying. But for women, the frontier offered something even more radical: freedom. In the cities of the East, Victorian society had women locked in a cage of propriety. A respectable woman couldn't vote, couldn't own property in her own name if married, couldn't pursue most professions, and was expected to be a model of virtue, piety, and domestic devotion. Her role was to be seen and not heard, to manage a household and bear children, to be the moral center of the family, while men handled the real business of life. Step outside these boundaries, and society would destroy you with gossip, scandal, and social exile. The rules were strict, and the punishment for breaking them severe. But out west, those rules became suggestions. The frontier was too raw, too desperate, too chaotic to maintain the rigid social structures of Eastern society. Women could own land. They could run businesses. They could work jobs that would have been unthinkable back east. More importantly, with law enforcement spread thin across vast distances and local communities more concerned with survival than propriety, women found they could get away with behaviors that would have landed them in scandal, or worse, back home. Some women used this freedom to become pioneering business owners or ranchers. Others saw a different kind of opportunity. If men could make a fortune through robbery and theft, why couldn't women do the same? And if society was going to underestimate them because of their gender, why not use that to their advantage? The female outlaws of the West understood something that their male counterparts often missed. Being a woman in a criminal enterprise wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. But make no mistake, these women didn't just benefit from society's blindness to female criminality. They earned their fearsome reputations through violence, cunning, and a ruthlessness that shocked even hardened criminals. Let's start with the most notorious of them all. Myra Maybelle Shirley was born in 1848 on a farm near Carthage, Missouri, to a family that gave her every advantage they could afford. She received a classical education, learned to play piano, and by all accounts was headed for a respectable middle-class life. She could have become a teacher or the wife of a merchant. She could have lived quietly in Missouri, raising children and attending church socials. But the Civil War changed everything. The war turned Missouri into a battlefield where neighbor fought neighbor. Confederate guerrillas and Union soldiers burned farms, executed prisoners, and terrorized civilians. Belle's family lost their business. Her brother Edwin rode with Confederate guerrillas and was killed by Union soldiers. The violence she witnessed during these years hardened her, stripped away any illusions about civilized behavior, and introduced her to men who would become some of the most notorious outlaws in American history. Frank and Jesse James hid at her family's farm, and the teenage Belle found herself fascinated by these dangerous men who lived by their own rules. After the war, when her family moved to Texas, hoping for a fresh start, Belle didn't leave that fascination behind. She married Jim Reed, a man already building a reputation as a criminal. For some women, discovering their husband was an outlaw would have been a disaster. For Belle, it was an invitation. By 1869, she wasn't just tolerating her husband's criminal activities, she was participating in them. Picture this scene from 1873. A gang of outlaws rides through the Texas darkness toward a prosperous homestead owned by a man named Wat Grayson. Intelligence suggests Grayson has recently come into possession of approximately $30,000 in gold coins, an absolute fortune by the standards of the day. The gang has been planning this robbery for weeks, studying the family's routines, identifying the best time to strike. They wait until after midnight, when the family is asleep, then surround the house. The Graysons wake to find armed figures standing over their bed, demanding to know where their gold is hidden. Wat Grayson denies the rumors, insisting there is no treasure. The gang drags him outside and prepares a noose, making their intentions unmistakable. When he still refuses, they bring out Mrs. Grayson and threaten her with the same fate. Unable to watch his wife endure such terror, Grayson finally gives in and reveals the hiding place. The outlaws retrieve the $30,000 and disappear into the night. A crime so shocking that even frontier communities accustomed to violence spoke of it for years. And according to reports from the time, some witnesses claimed that one of the riders was not a man at all, but a woman dressed in men's clothing, carrying her share of the stolen gold. Many accounts identified her as Belle Starr. Historical sources indicate the methods used against the Graysons were far more severe than the version we've told here, but for the sake of viewers, this summary reflects the story in broader, less graphic terms. What the reports generally agree on is that Belle Starr was portrayed as an active participant, rather than a reluctant bystander, though the exact extent of her involvement remains debated by historians. This wasn't a woman reluctantly involved in her husband's crimes. This was a woman who had chosen to be a criminal and was willing to do whatever that required. Belle wasn't content to be a criminal's wife. She wanted to be a criminal herself. She rode with Reed's gang, stealing cattle and horses throughout the Dallas area. She developed a distinctive style that would become her trademark, wearing velvet skirts and plumed hats, while carrying 2 pistols with cartridge belts across her hips. She rode side saddle like a lady while planning robberies like a bandit. When Reed was killed by lawmen in 1874, Belle didn't retreat into widowhood. She doubled down on the outlaw life. She moved to Indian Territory, what would later become Oklahoma, and established herself as something unprecedented in the West. She became a gang leader, not a gang member or an outlaw's woman, but the actual leader. She organized horse and cattle theft operations, coordinated the movement of stolen goods, and most importantly, she turned her ranch into a haven for fugitives. Any outlaw on the run knew they could find shelter at Belle Starr's place. She harbored some of the most wanted men in the West, providing them with food, fresh horses, and a place to hide, while lawmen searched elsewhere. In 1880, Belle married Sam Starr, a Cherokee outlaw from a family already notorious for their criminal activities. Together, they ran a criminal empire from their ranch called Younger's Bend. The place became legendary. Outlaws would ride in wounded from shootouts and ride out weeks later, healed and resupplied. Stolen horses would arrive in the dead of night and disappear by morning, sold through Belle's network of crooked dealers. Local lawmen knew what was happening but couldn't prove it. Belle was too smart, too careful, and she knew how to use her status as a woman to her advantage. When Belle and Sam were finally arrested for horse theft in 1882, they were brought before Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Parker was known as the hanging judge for the severity of his sentences. He'd sent dozens of men to the gallows, but when Belle Starr stood before him, she didn't cower. She didn't play the helpless woman. She met his gaze with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She and Sam were convicted and sent to prison in Detroit, but Belle served only 9 months of her sentence. a man who committed the same crimes would have hanged. Belle walked free and went right back to her criminal enterprises. Even after Sam was killed in a gunfight in 1886, Belle continued operating. She took up with Jim July, a Creek Indian outlaw 15 years younger than her. She was indicted several more times, including once for allegedly disguising herself as a man to rob a post office. She was never convicted again. She'd learned how to work the system, how to use her intelligence and her gender to stay one step ahead of the law. Prosecutors and judges simply couldn't reconcile the well-dressed, articulate woman in their courtroom with the ruthless criminal they knew her to be. But Belle's luck ran out on February 3rd, 1889, just 2 days before her 41st birthday. She was riding home from a general store when someone ambushed her from the woods. 2 shotgun blasts to the back. She fell from her horse and died in the dirt. Her killer was never identified. The list of suspects was long. A neighbor she'd feuded with, a former lover she'd rejected, her own son Eddie, who stood to inherit her property, Edgar Watson, a fugitive she'd kicked off her land when she discovered he was wanted for murder. Watson seemed the most likely culprit, and he was arrested, but with no witnesses and no evidence, he was released. Belle Starr was buried at Younger's Bend, her gravestone carved with a bell and a star, along with the images of her horse and her pistols. Within months, dime novels were being published about her life, most of them wildly inaccurate, but all of them cementing her status as the Bandit Queen of the West. The novels portrayed her as more violent, more beautiful, and more romantic than she actually was. But here's the truth that the novels got right. Belle Starr was genuinely dangerous. She organized criminal operations. She harbored killers. She participated in violent robberies. And she did it all while using society's assumptions about women to avoid the harsh justice that male outlaws faced. Belle Starr proved that a woman could be every bit as ruthless as any man in the West. But she wasn't alone. While Belle was building her criminal empire in Indian Territory, another woman was about to commit one of the last great stagecoach robberies in American history. Her name was Pearl Hart, and her story reveals just how far a desperate woman would go when the traditional avenues of survival were closed to her. Pearl Taylor was born around 1871 in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada, to a respectable, affluent family. Like Belle Starr, she received the best education her parents could provide. Unlike Belle, Pearl's descent into criminality wasn't gradual. It was a headlong dive, driven by desperation and a need to escape the suffocating expectations of respectable womanhood. By her early 20s, Pearl had learned that the life society had planned for her was impossible. She couldn't survive by following the rules. In 1893, when Pearl was 22 years old, everything changed. She attended the Chicago World's Fair, where Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was performing. She sat in the audience watching Annie Oakley shoot with deadly precision. She watched reenactments of stagecoach robberies and Indian battles. She watched a world where women could be something other than wives and mothers. The show planted an idea in her mind. If Annie Oakley could make a living with a gun, maybe there were other ways for women to use those skills. Pearl left Chicago that same year and headed west. She ended up in Arizona, working various jobs to survive. Some reports say she worked as a cook in a boarding house. Others suggest she worked in brothels. Either way, by 1899, Pearl was desperate. She'd received word that her mother was ill and needed money for medical care. She had no savings, no prospects, and no way to earn the money, honestly, in the time her mother had left. That's when she met Joe Boot. Joe Boot was a down-on-his-luck miner with big dreams and no way to achieve them. He'd been planning a crime for months, but he'd never had the courage to go through with it alone. When Pearl told him about her desperate situation, Boot saw an opportunity. He proposed they rob a stagecoach together. It was a crazy idea. By 1899, stagecoaches were nearly obsolete, replaced by trains. The route between Globe and Florence, Arizona, was one of the last operating stagecoach lines in the territory. It hadn't been robbed in years, which meant it didn't have an armed guard. It was the perfect target for amateurs. Pearl made a decision that would make her famous. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothing, and on May 30th, 1899, she and Joe Boot rode out into the Arizona desert. They waited at a watering point near Cane Springs Canyon, about 30 miles southwest of Globe. When the stagecoach came around the bend, Boot jumped into the road and shouted, "Throw up your hands!" Pearl, carrying a shotgun, held the passengers at gunpoint while Boot robbed them. Think about what this means for a moment. Pearl Hart, a woman barely over 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, dressed as a teenage boy, holding a shotgun on grown men who could have overpowered her if they'd realized what she was. But they didn't realize. They saw what they expected to see, a young male bandit, and they did exactly what she wanted. Pearl and Boot made off with $431.20, plus 2 pistols from the passengers and the driver's revolver. But here's where Pearl showed a streak of something unexpected. Before riding away, she gave each passenger $1. She told them it was so they could afford to eat when they reached the next town. Was it mercy? Or was it a calculated move to seem less threatening, to create sympathy for when she was eventually caught? We'll never know. What we do know is that Pearl Hart and Joe Boot were terrible outlaws. The driver didn't pursue them. He simply unhitched one of the horses and rode back to town to alert the sheriff. Meanwhile, Pearl and Boot got lost in the desert. Some reports say they simply couldn't find their way out. Others suggest they wandered in circles trying to avoid pursuit. Either way, a posse led by Sheriff Truman of Pinal County caught up with them 6 days later. They found both outlaws asleep. Boot surrendered without a fight. Pearl fought them. Even exhausted and knowing she had no chance of escape, she resisted arrest with everything she had. And then something remarkable happened. Pearl Hart became a celebrity. The novelty of a female stagecoach robber created a media frenzy that newspapers couldn't resist. National reporters descended on Florence, Arizona, all clamoring for interviews and photographs. Pearl gave them exactly what they wanted. She posed for pictures wearing her men's clothing and holding her weapons. She told stories about her desperate situation and her ailing mother. She played up every angle that might earn her public sympathy. One article in Cosmopolitan described her as just the opposite of what would be expected of a woman stage robber, while noting that, when angry or determined, hard lines show about her eyes and mouth. Pearl was held in the Florence jail because the Tucson facility didn't have accommodations for women. She was given a bobcat cub to keep as a pet. Locals brought her gifts. People lined up just to get a glimpse of the famous Lady Bandit. Pearl loved every minute of the attention. She signed autographs. She granted interviews. She became the story everyone was talking about from Arizona to New York. But Pearl Hart wasn't content with simply being famous. She wanted to be free. On October 12, 1899, Pearl escaped from jail, leaving an 18-inch hole in the adobe wall. Some believe she had help from the inside. For a few glorious days, the legend of Pearl Hart grew even larger as lawmen searched for the escaped female outlaw. But her freedom was short-lived. She'd posed for too many photographs. Her face was too recognizable. When she was spotted near Deming, New Mexico, a law enforcement official recognized her from pictures he'd seen in Cosmopolitan magazine. Pearl was recaptured and returned to jail. Her trial in November 1899 revealed Pearl's shrewd understanding of how to manipulate public opinion. She stood before the judge and declared, "I shall not consent to be tried under a law in which my sex had no voice in making." It was a powerful statement about women's suffrage that resonated with audiences nationwide. She admitted her guilt, but claimed she only robbed the stagecoach to help her dying mother. She pleaded with the jury to show mercy for a first-time offender who'd acted out of desperation, not malice. The jury, composed entirely of men, acquitted her. Judge Fletcher Doane was furious. He scolded the jurors for failing to do their duty, accusing them of being swayed by Pearl's feminine charms rather than the evidence. And he was probably right. It's almost impossible to imagine a male stagecoach robber who admitted his guilt being acquitted simply because the jury felt sorry for him. But Pearl was a woman, and the jury couldn't bring themselves to convict her. However, Judge Doane wasn't finished. Immediately after the acquittal, Pearl was rearrested on federal charges of tampering with U.S. mail, since the stagecoach had been carrying letters and parcels, and for stealing the driver's pistol. This time, there was no sympathetic jury to save her. She was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in Yuma Territorial Prison. Joe Boot, by contrast, received 30 years. Pearl's time in Yuma became as famous as the robbery itself. She was the only female prisoner, and the prison made the most of it. They gave her a special cell with an outdoor yard. They allowed her to give interviews and pose for photographs. Visitors came from all over just to see the notorious female outlaw behind bars. Pearl, ever the showwoman, entertained them all. She wrote poetry. She gave tours of her cell. She maintained her celebrity status even while imprisoned. After serving just 18 months of her sentence, Pearl was released. The official reason was that she'd become pregnant while in prison, which raised all sorts of uncomfortable questions about prison security and guard conduct. Rather than deal with the scandal, the governor simply pardoned her and sent her on her way. No child materialized after her release, leading many to suspect Pearl had faked the pregnancy to secure her freedom. What happened to Pearl Hart after her release remains somewhat mysterious. Some accounts say she briefly joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, the same show that had inspired her outlaw career, performing under an alias as the Arizona Bandit. Other reports, more credible but less exciting, suggest she married a rancher named Calvin Bywater and lived quietly in Arizona, working as a seamstress and interior decorator. If Mrs. Bywater was indeed Pearl Hart, she lived into her 80s, described by neighbors as soft-spoken, kind, and a good citizen in all respects. Pearl Hart's story reveals something crucial about female outlaws in the West. They understood the power of performance. Pearl used her gender, her appearance, and her ability to tell a sympathetic story to manipulate judges, juries, and the public. She committed a serious crime, fought the police, escaped from jail, and still managed to serve only a fraction of the sentence a man would have received. And she did it all while becoming a celebrity. Her image sold on postcards and featured in national magazines. But if Pearl Hart showed how a woman could use public sympathy to her advantage, our next outlaw proved that some women didn't need sympathy. They needed to be feared. Laura Bullion didn't just join a gang. She became one of the most effective members of the most notorious outlaw gang in American history. And she did it by being every bit as cold, professional, and ruthless as the men she rode with. Laura Bullion was born around 1876 in Knickerbocker, Texas, a town that was essentially a haven for outlaws. Her father, Henry Bullion, was a Native American bank robber. Her mother was a German immigrant. If genetics and environment determined destiny, Laura never had a chance at a respectable life. Growing up in a family of outlaws, Laura learned early that crime was simply business. Her uncle by marriage, William News Carver, rode with Blackjack Ketchum's gang of train robbers. Through these family connections, Laura met the men who would define her adult life, including Will Carver himself. But Laura wasn't content to remain on the sidelines. She wanted to be part of the action. When Carver joined up with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, operating out of the famous hole-in-the-wall hideout in Wyoming, Laura followed. The Wild Bunch was the most successful criminal organization in the West, pulling off bank and train robberies that netted tens of thousands of dollars. They were smart, organized, and absolutely ruthless when they needed to be, and they accepted Laura as one of their own. The gang gave her the nickname Della Rose, later evolving to Rose of the Wild Bunch. But Laura quickly earned a more fitting nickname, the Thorny Rose. Because while she could be charming and feminine when it suited her purposes, she was thorns first when it came to actual criminal work. Laura's role in the gang was brilliantly conceived. She could move through towns buying supplies while the men remained hidden. She would fence stolen goods, selling them through contacts she'd cultivated. She would forge signatures on documents and banknotes with a skill that impressed even the professional criminals she worked with. But most importantly, Laura Bullion would disguise herself as a boy and participate directly in robberies. Think about the advantage this gave the gang. Witnesses would describe the robbers. 4 men, they'd say, medium height, wearing bandanas over their faces. They'd never suspect that one of those men was actually a woman. Even when Laura's face was partially visible, her features, described as somewhat masculine by contemporary accounts, allowed her to pass convincingly as a young man. Law enforcement would search for 4 male outlaws and never even consider that one of them might be female. Laura participated in multiple train robberies with the Wild Bunch throughout the 1890s. The gang would board trains, force the engineer to stop, blow open the safe cars with dynamite, and make off with whatever was inside. It was dangerous, violent work. People died in these robberies, both gang members and innocent bystanders. Laura wasn't squeamish about any of it. She did what needed to be done. In 1900, Laura took part in the Great Northern Train Robbery, one of the Wild Bunch's most lucrative jobs. The gang stopped the train near Wagner, Montana, and made off with more than $40,000. It was a massive haul, enough money to let the gang members disappear and live comfortably for years. But the success of the robbery also brought unprecedented law enforcement attention. By 1901, the Wild Bunch was falling apart. Will Carver, Laura's former lover, was ambushed and killed by lawmen in April. Laura had already moved on romantically to Ben Kilpatrick, known as the Tall Texan, another member of the gang. After Carver's death, Laura and Kilpatrick fled east, trying to lay low and escape the heat from law enforcement. They settled in St. Louis, Missouri, living under the names Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Arnold. For a few months, it seemed like they'd gotten away with it. But the Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by the railroad companies to track down the Wild Bunch, was relentless. On November 8, 1901, Pinkerton agents raided the hotel where Laura and Kilpatrick were staying. Kilpatrick refused to talk, maintaining his silence even under interrogation. So the agents searched the hotel room. What they found was incriminating beyond anything they'd hoped for. Laura was leaving the room with a suitcase. Inside that suitcase was thousands of dollars in banknotes, easily traceable to the Montana train robbery. The bills were still in their original wrapping. It was the smoking gun that connected them directly to the crime. Laura and Kilpatrick were arrested and tried separately. The newspaper coverage reveals something fascinating about how Laura was perceived. The New York Times reported that she was masquerading as Mrs. Nellie Rose and noted suspicion that she, disguised as a boy, might have participated in multiple train robberies. The chief of detectives was quoted as saying, "I wouldn't think helping to hold up a train was too much for her. She is cool, shows absolutely no fear, and in male attire would readily pass for a boy. She has a masculine face, and that would give her assurance in her disguise." In other words, law enforcement recognized that Laura Bullion wasn't some hapless woman caught up in her boyfriend's criminal activities. She was a professional outlaw in her own right, capable of violence, skilled in deception, and absolutely fearless. They treated her as a serious criminal, and the courts followed suit. Ben Kilpatrick received a 20-year sentence. Laura received 5 years and was sent to the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. The difference in sentences had nothing to do with their relative guilt. Both had committed the same crimes, but prosecutors likely believed that Laura could be reformed while Kilpatrick was a hardened criminal beyond redemption. They were wrong on both counts. Laura served 3.5 years before being released in September 1905. Kilpatrick kept in contact with her through letters, believing they would reunite when he was released. But Laura had decided she was done with the outlaw life. When Kilpatrick was finally released in 1911, he immediately went back to robbery. He was killed during a botched train hold-up in 1912. Laura, meanwhile, had disappeared. She resurfaced in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1918, living under the name Frida Bullion Lincoln and claiming to be a widow whose husband had died fighting in World War I. It was a complete fabrication, but it allowed her to live a respectable life. She worked as a seamstress, then as a drapery maker, and eventually as an interior designer. Her clients had no idea that the quiet, professional woman making their curtains had once robbed trains with Butch Cassidy. Laura Bullion kept her secret until her death in 1961 of heart disease. She was the last surviving member of the Wild Bunch, living long enough to see the Old West become ancient history. But if Laura Bullion proved that women could be professional criminals who matched men in technical skill and cold-blooded efficiency, another woman demonstrated that female outlaws could also be criminal masterminds, using intelligence and manipulation rather than guns and disguises. Her name was Belle Siddons, though the world would come to know her by a different name, Madame Vestal. And her story reveals that some of the most dangerous outlaws in the West never fired a shot themselves. They were the ones planning the crimes, gathering the intelligence, and making sure that when others pulled the trigger, they were aiming at exactly the right target. Born around 1842 to a wealthy, politically powerful family in St. Louis, Missouri, Belle could have lived the pampered existence of a Southern belle. But when the Civil War erupted, Belle discovered she had a talent for deception and a taste for danger that no amount of social respectability could satisfy. At 25, Belle made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She became a Confederate spy, using her beauty and social connections to seduce Union soldiers and extract military secrets. She romanced officers, attended social gatherings where loose lips revealed troop movements and supply routes, and passed everything she learned to Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Belle was good at her work, so good that she later bragged in court about enabling Forrest to prevail against Grant's troops at the Battle of the Mobile and Memphis Railway. But espionage is a dangerous game, and Belle's luck eventually ran out. Federal authorities caught her in 1862 and threw her in prison in St. Louis. Most women would have been terrified, would have begged for mercy, would have promised never to engage in such activities again. Belle did the opposite. She stood before the court and boasted about her accomplishments, detailing how her intelligence had helped the Confederacy win battles. It was an act of defiance that should have earned her years in prison or worse. Instead, she was pardoned after just 4 months, likely because authorities didn't know what to do with a woman who refused to show remorse or fear. After the war, Belle married a gambler named Newt Hallett, who taught her to play cards. Belle discovered she had a natural gift for gambling, particularly for dealing 21, the game that would later be known as blackjack. When Hallett died of yellow fever, leaving Belle widowed and alone, she didn't mourn long. She saw an opportunity. News of the gold strike in the Black Hills was spreading across the country, and wherever there was gold, there were men with money burning holes in their pockets. Men who liked to gamble. Belle followed the gold rush to Deadwood, South Dakota, one of the wildest, most lawless towns in the entire West. She reinvented herself as Madame Vestal, adopting a persona that was part mystery, part seduction. Dressed in red velvet gowns and dripping with rubies, Madame Vestal set up her own combination dance hall, bar, and gambling establishment. She became the toast of Deadwood, even earning the nickname Queen of the Black Hills. The local newspaper described her as a flawlessly groomed beauty, inviting, sultry, and sensuous. Madame Vestal ran her gambling tables with a pistol casually placed beside her dealing box, a not-so-subtle reminder that she was nobody's fool. She shuffled cards and spun the roulette wheel with cold efficiency, and the house rarely lost when Madame Vestal was dealing. She later confessed her philosophy. My luck was invariable, and I had a superstition that if I allowed the first thought of kindness to enter my soul, it would break the spell. I hated every man who came to play against me. They came to break my bank. Why should I spare them? Belle hobnobbed with the likes of Wild Bill Hickok and John Wesley Hardin, the most dangerous men on the frontier. She thrived in Deadwood's violent, chaotic atmosphere, where fortunes changed hands nightly and where murder was common enough to barely rate a mention in the papers. For a woman who had once been a proper Southern debutante, Madame Vestal seemed perfectly comfortable in this world of gamblers, gunfighters, and outlaws. Then Archie McLaughlin walked into her establishment. Archie was handsome, charming, and dangerous, a former member of Quantrill's Raiders who had turned to stagecoach robbery after the war. He came to Madame Vestal's table night after night, happy to lose his ill-gotten gains as long as he did so in her presence. Belle fell in love, perhaps for the first time in her life, and love made her reckless. Belle agreed to use her talents as a spy once again, this time for criminal purposes rather than military ones. She would charm information out of stagecoach drivers who came to gamble at her tables. When were the coaches traveling? What routes were they taking? What valuable cargo were they carrying? Belle extracted this information with practiced ease, flirting and pouring drinks, and making the drivers feel important, all while memorizing every detail they let slip. She passed the intelligence to Archie, who used it to plan robberies with devastating precision. According to newspapers, no robbery was undertaken which Belle disapproved of, and none failed when she advised and planned the details. Belle wasn't just Archie's lover. She was his strategist, the mastermind behind a string of successful stagecoach robberies that plagued the routes around Deadwood. The combination of Belle's intelligence gathering and Archie's willingness to use violence made them rich and made them feared. But Belle's overconfidence proved to be her downfall. One night, perhaps drunk on her own success, or simply careless after too much whiskey, Belle let slip to someone that a robbery was being planned. Word got back to Lawman Boone May, who organized a group to intercept the robbery. Archie McLaughlin and his accomplice Billy Mansfield were captured, but they never made it to trial in Deadwood. Vigilantes intercepted them on the journey and hanged them both from a cottonwood tree. According to historical accounts, Archie McLaughlin's death deeply affected Belle Siddons, sending her into a long decline marked by heavy drinking and worsening dependence on narcotics. In 1881, she was arrested in San Francisco, where she reluctantly shared her story with a reporter after newspapers labeled her a beautiful wretch. Soon after, she disappeared from the record entirely. Unlike other female outlaws of the era, no definitive account of Madame Vestal's final years exists. She simply vanished, leaving behind the legend of a once brilliant Confederate spy turned criminal strategist who helped orchestrate robberies across the West. These female outlaws came from different backgrounds and pursued crime through different methods. Belle Starr built her power through intimidation and organization. Pearl Hart used audacity and manipulation. Laura Bullion succeeded through professional competence and technical skill. Belle Siddons wielded intelligence and information like weapons. But they all shared something crucial. They all chose to live outside the law, regardless of the consequences. These women committed real crimes and hurt real people. But their stories remind us that history is more complicated than the legends we've been told. The West wasn't shaped by men alone. Women were there too, for better and for worse. If you've made it to this part, then thank you for being on this journey with us. A like and subscribe would be truly appreciated.